History as it happens, June 15th, 2023. Whatever happened to the two-state solution?
The Palestinians will have the right to participate in the determination of their own future. In negotiations which will resolve the final status of the West Bank and Gaza.
In the now 6-month-long Palestinian uprising against the occupation, the protesters appear determined to harass the army.
We have an opportunity to bring about a just and enduring end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the independent Jewish state. British rule is at an end.
No problem I faced while I was President of the United States was more controversial or more complex than the problem of Israel.
That hallowed piece of earth, that land of light and revelation, is the home to the memories and dreams of Jews, Muslims, and Christians throughout the world.
The Israeli and the Palestinian peoples, who fought each other for almost a century, have agreed to move decisively on the path of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
In our world of dizzying change, a decades-old conflict remains the same. Israel and the Palestinians are no closer to reaching a two-state solution today than they were in 1948. This is why a group of Middle East scholars say, let's face reality. In their view, Israel is one state resembling apartheid, leaving generations of Palestinians mired in poverty and violence. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Cannot go back to the 1967 lines because these lines are indefensible.
Unless there is some kind of great disruption that moves the needle back towards a negotiated settlement, we're just going to see more violence and oppression.
When did the two-state solution die? Or maybe the better question is, when was it killed off and by whom? Some have argued it was never really alive, and if you have even a cursory understanding of the history since May 14, 1948, the date the State of Israel was created, sparking the first Arab-Israeli War, you know that attempts to peacefully resolve the conflict led to brief moments of optimism, followed by failure and more violence. Take the final year of Bill Clinton's presidency. This was about 7 years after he, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin,
a Middle East of hope,
and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat stood together on the White House lawn to announce the Oslo Accords in 1993. Rabin would be assassinated in 1995. Here's Clinton after the failure of the Camp David summit in 2000, again the final year of his second term.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time. As I explained on the eve of the summit, success was far from guaranteed, given the historical, religious, political, and emotional dimensions of the conflict. Still, because the parties were not making progress on their own and the September deadline they set for themselves was fast approaching, I thought we had no choice. We can't afford to leave a single stone unturned in the search for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Now, at Camp David, both sides engaged in comprehensive discussions that were really unprecedented because they dealt with the most sensitive issues dividing them. Profound and complex questions that long had been considered off limits. Under the operating rules that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, they are, of course, not bound by any proposal discussed at the summit. However, while we did not get an agreement here, significant progress was made on the core issues.
5 years of bloodshed followed, the Second Intifada. This second Palestinian uprising was sparked by then-Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon's appearance at the Temple Mount on September 28th, just a couple months after the Camp David summit ended. At the time, Edward Said wrote in The Nation, "Flawed from the start, the Oslo peace process has entered its terminal phase of violent confrontation, disproportionately massive Israeli repression, widespread Palestinian rebellion, and great loss of life, mainly Palestinian. A new sense may actually be dawning that only a mass movement against Israeli apartheid will work." Again, that is the late Edward Said writing 23 years ago. The result of the Second Intifada was 1,083 Israelis killed, mostly civilians, in a string of suicide bombings. About 3,000 Palestinians were killed. Thousands of Palestinian homes were demolished by the Israeli army. Israel erected a barrier wall around the West Bank. If all this marked the end of any realistic hope for a two-state solution, it didn't stop world leaders from clinging to that idea, at least publicly.
Secure Israeli state, a Jewish state, living side by side in peace and security.
Even though some of the problems seem to preclude the possibility of compromise. For instance, it's easy to say we should have two states, but where should the borders go? Many Palestinians want Israel to evacuate all the territory it occupied after the 1967 war, including West Bank settlements that are home to 450,000 Israelis. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made clear in a White House meeting with President Obama in 2011, this will never happen, at least not while he's in power.
While Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible, because they don't take into account certain changes that have taken place on the ground, demographic changes that have taken place over the last 44 years. Remember that before 1967, Israel was all of 9 miles wide. It was half the width of the Washington Beltway. And these were not the boundaries of peace. They were the boundaries of repeated wars, because the attack on Israel was so attractive from them. So we can't go back to those indefensible lines, and we're going to have a long-term military presence along the Jordan. I discussed this with the president. I think that we understand that Israel has certain security requirements that will have to come into place in any deal that we make.
And Netanyahu is back in power today at the head of a right-wing government. So in a short podcast, there isn't enough time to go over everything that's happened since 1948. But wherever you fall in this debate over who is to blame for the absence of peace, 4 scholars of the Middle East say we need to recognize the two-state solution is dead. Israel is a one-state reality. Writing in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, Michael Barnett, Nathan Brown, Mark Lynch, and Shibli Telhami say Palestine is not a state in waiting, and Israel is not a democratic state incidentally occupying Palestinian territory. All the territory west of the Jordan River has long constituted a single state under Israeli rule, where the land and the people are subject to radically different legal regimes, and Palestinians are permanently treated as a lower caste. Policymakers and analysts who ignore this one-state reality will be condemned to failure and irrelevance, doing little beyond providing a smokescreen for the entrenchment of the status quo. The 4 authors reserve most of their criticism for Israel, saying it resembles an apartheid state. Their essay provoked a response from supporters of Israel, including some scholars such as Robert Satloff, who wrote in Foreign Affairs, "The author's pseudo-academic argument is little more than political advocacy." Satloff says they refuse to blame the Palestinians for the failure of the peace process because they want to target Israel's existence as a Jewish state. So I understand that getting you to change your mind about this issue, this conflict, is really difficult. But that's not my goal here. We can look at the argument that Israel is living a one-state reality with an open mind, even if it doesn't change your mind. And that is why I invited Michael Barnett, professor of international affairs and political science at George Washington University, on the podcast. He and his aforementioned colleagues are the editors of a new book, The One-State Reality: What is Israel-Palestine? Michael Barnett, hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we begin by allowing you to address the op-ed that appeared in my own newspaper. It was written by Clifford May about your essay in Foreign Affairs about the one-state reality. I'm an employee of the Washington Times, of course, but I'm not obligated to agree with every opinion that is written in it, and I know that you did not appreciate this piece either, so I'll give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, probably best to give a little background for those who are not familiar with the essay that was published by Foreign Affairs and written by myself and Mark Lynch and Nathan Brown and Shibli Tilhami. You know, in brevity, what we argue is that Israel-Palestine, if you will, has become a one-state reality, and that Israel now is a single state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And it is a state because Israel controls administratively, in terms of security processes, legal discourses and texts. It maintains, virtually absolute control now over the territories and Israel proper, although with the continued distinction in some ways between the territories and Israel. But it's a one-state reality, and that for us is pretty straightforward. So that Israel becomes then a single state. That single state is one in which Jews have citizenship, have political power and representation. The 6 million odd non-Jews, including 1 million or so Israeli Arab citizens who do have citizenship. But then there are the other 5 million or so, those who live in Gaza and in the West Bank, who don't have citizenship. And then the question becomes, well, what kind of state is it? We argue that it's akin to apartheid. You can see the way I've answered the first question, it sets up the second question, which is that Israel is now a state in which it has a different set of laws, it has different set of politics for those who are Jews versus those who are non-Jews. And Jews are accorded more rights and more responsibilities than are non-Jews. And that's not just simply a matter of informality that's emerged over the decades. That's also now, and increasingly so, carved into Israeli law. And that law, in many ways, is designed to maintain what we call Jewish supremacy. It's designed to make sure that Israel stays a Jewish state. As a matter of fact, then requires the denial of basic rights to non-Jews. And that's all part of law. So given that kind of systematic discrimination that now exists, it resembles an apartheid state. Now, those are fighting words for a lot of people who are strong defenders of Israel. And we've gotten a lot of very strong responses. Some have been quite civil and argue with some of our claims based on the evidence. Others, I would say, are uncivil. And rather than engaging the arguments, instead what they do is saber rattle, name calling. And the piece in the Washington Times was in many ways a classic example of this. Doesn't really argue with what we're observing, but rather instead, under the inflammatory title of, I think it was, Stalinist approach to peace in the Middle East, accusing us of wanting to destroy Israel, which is not something we want or we argue, makes all kinds of other accusations that essentially willfully misinterprets or misrepresents our arguments, quotes what I thought was an outrageous piece by Elliot Abrams of the Council on Foreign Relations, which did the same thing. Again, willful misinterpretation or manipulation of what we say, all for the sake of dismissing us and our arguments and for defending Israel. So that piece in the Washington Times is just one of many that we have received and read since our essay came out.
And Foreign Affairs, which is the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, also published a number of responses to your initial essay, and then you responded to those responses. I will put the links to those articles at the page for this podcast episode at washingtontimes.com so people can read them. Some of the responses published by Foreign Affairs were also polemical, but some also were principled, where they addressed the arguments you're making. So you're saying resembles an apartheid state. What does that mean if it's not quite apartheid, but resembles it?
Yeah, and I think at one point we used the language of rhymes with apartheid. It remains somewhat debatable about what counts as apartheid. Now, many people will immediately think of the South African example, and therefore claims that Israel is an apartheid state then have to measure up to what we understand to be apartheid in South Africa. And like with all historical analogies, it's never perfect. It's never one-to-one. Many who object to the language of apartheid as applied to Israel will make claims like, well, this is not race. As a consequence, it can't be apartheid. When in fact, international law has a definition of apartheid, which is not exclusively about race. It extends it to other forms of systematic discrimination, which would include issues of ethnicity and religion, which is the basis of discrimination in Israeli law. It is also a recognition that all kinds of apartheid that exist throughout the world, and Israel's not the only one that has systematic discrimination as a matter of law, but it is to draw attention to the way in which these things can vary historically. So in the book that we co-edited, that's available for Cornell Press, shameless
No problem.
book plug, we mentioned the caste system in India, Jim Crow in the United States, that there are other examples that would fall under this definition of apartheid. So Israel's not the only one. The other reason, and this would be I'll associate this with myself as opposed to my co-authors, I worry that somehow the language of apartheid, which is for many people like throwing a red flag in front of a bull, and then you end up with these very long conversations about what is apartheid, whether Israel's apartheid, and so forth. When in fact, for me, the real issue is not whether we decide that we're going to call it apartheid, but rather that we recognize that what's taking place in Israel is systematic discrimination that's designed to maintain Jewish superiority and privilege, supremacy over non-Jews.
We have 5 million people living under Israeli military occupation, an occupation that has gone on now for decades and decades. My takeaway from your piece, the use of the word apartheid aside, was let's be real here. Let's stop talking about the two-state solution like it's still alive. You weren't taking a position that you are for the current one-state reality, that if the two-state solution was actually possible, you'd be for it potentially, but that's not what's happening now. So when did the two-state solution, in your view, die or just kind of wither away? Because it's not easy to identify a single day or month or year or single development that killed it off.
Well, first off, I appreciate you reading the piece because many of our critics, I don't think, have read the piece. They just read others who have misinterpreted the piece.
I did not object to your piece, to be honest. So I thought it was interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so, we argue that part of the problem now with the way people present the question of Israel-Palestine is they keep relying on the crutch of a two-state solution, which all four of us supported even before anybody had heard of Oslo. And so we were quite in favor of a two-state solution, if possible, to be negotiated by the parties. That, for us, was always the most just and most likely to generate some form of stability between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so we don't argue that the absence of a two-state solution presents a one-state reality that is a solution to anything. We think this just continues the tragedy and the violence and the conflict. But you're quite right. Sort of when do we carbon date the beginning of this one-state reality? I think there were several moments. This is a developing process. I think one was certainly the end of serious negotiations for a two-state solution, which, one can date at the end of the Clinton administration. There were, a variety of attempts, none very serious and none that went very far by the Israelis and the Palestinian leadership subsequent to that. The Second Intifada did not help.
It was a disaster for the Palestinians, above all.
Disaster for the Palestinians and made a deep impression on the Israelis, given that it happened after the collapse of negotiations. And the last was probably the 2005 withdrawal by Israel from Gaza, and then the vacuum that was filled by Hamas. One of the things that did was it convinced the Israelis that not only are the Palestinians not serious about any kind of two-state solution, but that any attempt by the Israelis to even engage in these kinds of unilateral gestures would be answered with more violence. And so at that point, what you found, a general move by almost across Israeli society to simply dig into the status quo and to continue to repeat that there is no leadership with whom we can negotiate. The Palestinians are divided. So as a consequence, they don't have negotiating authority. And so at that point, I think the two-state solution as a realistic alternative died, and the one-state reality really came of age. And so in a nutshell, it's when people no longer negotiated or even thought about a two-state reality, which was two-state solution, which was about a decade ago. And so one of the reasons that we wrote the piece and engaged in the project that led to the book was a kind of, please people, open your eyes to what's going on, that the diplomatic community continues to use the two-state solution as an opium. It's a crutch. It's a coping mechanism that actually at this point has done more harm than good, because as that two-state solution continues to be bandied about, Israel has continued to build settlements and exert control in the territories.
Yeah, about 450,000 Israelis over time have settled on the West Bank. And the settlements are arguably the biggest issue here, or the biggest catalyst for conflict, wouldn't you say?
They're not just a catalyst for conflict, they are a source of conflict. One of the things that has been routinely identified by observers of the occupation, and there was just a report by the EU on this matter, was that it's kind of an open field day for settlers who want to engage in violence against the residents, against the Palestinians, with no attempt at restraint by the Israeli military forces and no attempt to hold them accountable, arresting, putting them on trial or anything else. And so, violence is an ongoing issue in the territories. There's a lot of attention always paid to Palestinians that engage in violence, but not nearly as much to the violence that is done by Israeli settlers to Palestinians.
I want to return to Oslo in a moment. You mentioned Oslo 93, then there was Oslo 2 in 95. And just to think of an American president, a Palestinian leader, and an Israeli prime minister all standing together today, right, on the White House lawn holding a news conference. We're so far away from that reality. What I inferred from some of your critics, or really most of your critics, that if there were a single binational state with Palestinians receiving the same rights and representation as Israelis, meaning civil rights and political rights, the rights they don't have now, they would simply use their new majority in a democracy to turn the tables on Jews. In other words, in order for Jews to live in peace and safety, Israel has to maintain its Jewish identity, because if they were a minority in a democratic Israel, they would be treated terribly, just as Palestinians are treated today.
I don't think a binational state is a solution to what we see. That's why we think the one-state reality is not a one-state solution. So we are not bullish about the idea that somehow this new situation, whether it maintains Jewish supremacy or leads to a confederation, which some people now propose, or leads to a state in which Palestinians become the majority, will lead to any kind of security or peace. We can imagine a lot of very disastrous scenarios, especially where the means of violence, the tools of the state, remain in Jewish hands. I mean, this is going to be an awful bloody mess. One of the questions then is when we talk about rights for Palestinians, what are we talking about? And we don't go so far as to say that Palestinians need voting rights so that they have representation in the Israeli Knesset. What our argument is that what Palestinians need are not just simply the rights to self-determination, which isn't going to exist certainly in the near future, but there are other kinds of rights that they have that are being denied by the Israeli authorities. Rights that come under refugee law, rights that come under humanitarian law, rights that come under the laws of war. These are rights that, and basic human rights, these are rights that they have that are denied by the Israelis. So the things that the Israelis do on a routinized matter, whether it's collective punishment as they demolish homes of Palestinian residents, settlement building is a war crime, pure and simple. And settlement expansion is not just simply obstacle to peace. It is a war crime. It's a violation of international humanitarian law. And so these are rights that the Palestinians have under international law. And the problem is, to this day, it's been, the Israelis have had complete control over whether those rights are acknowledged. And the Palestinians have no protections when they are violated. So that's the urgency as I see it. The Palestinian rights as they currently exist, not as we imagine them in the future, but as they currently exist, need to be recognized. And there needs to be greater international authority to make sure that the Israelis comply with those rights.
For a while, it was assumed that Israel could not sustain politically, militarily, the occupation of the Palestinian territories for as long as it has. But that's been proven wrong, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. There was a sense that, everybody kept talking about that at some point the parties will come to their senses and they'll realize a two-state solution is the only viable alternative. I think we're all aware of governments and leaders doing things that they think are rational, but end up leading them to collective irrationality. And that's kind of what's happened here. The idea that somehow you could continue the status quo indefinitely, at least that was the view of the Israelis, without costs or consequences, was something that allowed the myth of a benign occupation followed by, some form of stability to continue. I think in many ways, what I always worried about, and this has gone on for decades, is that Israel was sitting on a demographic time bomb. There was a knowledge that at some point, Palestinians would outnumber Jews. And we're at that moment where it's either an equal balance or a slight favor for Palestinian Arabs. And then the question becomes, what is Israel going to do when it is, in many ways, then a minority population in this territory? That's what we're facing now. I mean, it is a situation that many people dreaded and feared for the reasons that we're seeing, and hoped that the parties would come to their senses. But in fact, that's not happened.
Well, not that anyone cares what I think, but I am in principle opposed to any state being formed on a religious identity. That's in the abstract. In the real world, one understands why Israel was formed as a explicitly Jewish state, given the history, persecution, the genocide of World War II, among many historical issues and connections to that land. But your point about the demographic issues, and to my earlier question too, if there were one state and everyone had the same political and civil rights, there is a concern that Palestinians would then use that majority to discriminate against Jews, and we'd be right back where we are now, except the shoe would be on the other foot.
It's quite possible. And for anyone who dismisses that possibility, I'd say they were being naive. There is that chance, which is, again, why we don't think, a binational state or this one state reality would be a solution. I think it would mean further conflict, it's not as if you would find mass reconciliation immediately. And in addition, there will always be spoilers on both sides.
Naturally.
Who would be ready to destabilize anything that even, the majority of both populations came to accept.
Well, Israel reached a peace deal with Egypt, with Jordan, but this is different. These are competing claims to the same piece of land. One of your critics, Assad Ghanem, said that your essay should have paid more attention to problems on the Palestinian side. So let me ask you that now. Why have Palestinians, actually a two-pronged question, why have Palestinians failed to establish a unified national movement? Because from the very beginning, and I'm holding here historian William Cleveland's old book, A History of the Modern Middle East, he said even from the very start, the PLO itself was formed by the Arab League. He called these non-Palestinian solutions to the Palestinian question. Even the most specifically Palestinian organization of the time was little more than an instrument of the Arab state. So that's part one, and you can take these one part at a time. The second part is, conversely today, Arab states seemingly have given up on the Palestinian cause, want nothing to do with them, no one wants them. So why don't we go part one first, makes sense. Why have Palestinians failed to establish a unified national movement?
Well, on the first part, yes, the PLO was created by the Arab League. It was designed in many ways to try to restrain what the Palestinians might do and what they may consider to be, fruitful Palestinian action. Unfortunately for the Arab states, the PLO had a very wily leader, Yasser Arafat, who quickly established the PLO's autonomy and was able to strike on his own, even to the point where he struck against King Hussein of Jordan in 1970 and demonstrated he could not be controlled, or the PLO could not be controlled. And after a while, the PLO did come to represent, for many people, the representation of the Palestinian national aspirations. And then it became, of course, rather than, let's say, some other subset of Palestinians becoming in charge of negotiations, it all ran through the PLO. And even those Palestinians who disagreed with the PLO, nevertheless felt the need to maintain a united front. There were always splinter groups, of course, but the PLO was able to maintain its legitimacy within the Palestinian cause. That carried over to 93, 94, and then with the return of the PLO from Tunis to the territories, which was part of the Oslo process. But one of the things that unfortunately happened was that, and for a variety of complicated circumstances, I think it is fair to say that Palestinian Authority became quite corrupt. It has very little popular support from the Palestinians. We know that there is an alternative leadership from Hamas that controls Gaza and has a substantial amount of inroads within the West Bank. And we also know that the Palestinian Authority is not very popular with most rank-and-file Palestinians in the West Bank because they're viewed as a subcontractor of Israel. They do Israel's bidding. They're inherently corrupt. They provide little protection for the Palestinians and, in fact, represent a major threat to Palestinian lives along with the Israelis. There's been this constant clamor that there has to be a change in leadership. There have been no elections for a new Palestinian leadership. Debates about what happens after Mahmoud Abbas passes from the scene remain unresolved, although, there's a succession process in order that would maintain the Palestinian Authority. One of the consequences of that is that Palestinian youth are just, mired in hopelessness and despair. They don't have any authentic leadership. Where they go next is really anybody's.
Yeah, well, that's what. Yeah, there's a concern that there will be another uprising, intifada. So, second part of my question, I should have just asked two separate questions, so thank you for hanging in there. Arab states at one point made it a point to represent the Palestinians in negotiations with the United States, Israel, whoever. That seems also to have passed into the history books. Why have some, not all, some Arab states, for instance, the ones that signed the Abraham Accords, given up on the Palestinians?
Well, I don't know if they necessarily given up on the Palestinians, because that presumes that they actually ever cared about the Palestinians. One interpretation of the historical record is that certainly since 1948, the Arab states have essentially used the Palestinians as a way of legitimating their own regime and demonstrating some degree of inter-Arab solidarity. But when push came to shove, there was never really a great concern for the Palestinians. It was always a political point. There was oftentimes this phrase during Oslo that the Israelis should not enjoy the fruits of peace before the facts of peace, which meant that Arab states would not go faster than the Palestinians in terms of the peace process. Those were the good old days of the 1990s. We are far beyond that. The states that have been signing the Abrahamic Accords are in many ways peripheral to the Arab national cause. And so I think
Gulf states, small Gulf states.
Small Gulf states. And as a consequence, they feel like they can get away with, making overtures to Israel without having to suffer any kind of political costs at home. So it's all part of the calculation. And it's also part of a cost-benefit analysis with respect to, does having some kind of rapprochement with Israel deliver some benefits? And if it doesn't deliver benefits, then there's no reason to do it. Clearly they've decided that there are mainly strategic benefits to be had by having relations with Israel.
One point you've made is that Arab dictators, autocrats, are less interested in the Palestinian cause than their own publics. To the publics in these countries, it's still an issue.
Well, it's still an issue, but the question is, what kind of costs are you willing to absorb? So you can say we care deeply about the Palestinians, but are you ready to go to war? Are you ready to engage in various kinds of sanctions? I think for many, Arab states, there's clear solidarity with the Palestinian cause. I mean, they rightly see that Palestinians are part of the Arab world, part of the Arab community, that idea that Israel is an outpost of the West. And so, it does resonate with many people in the Arab world. But, at what cost?
I think they've realized there's no way to force Israel to do what it's not going to do.
Yeah, there is no way. And now the question is, can you slowly move towards Israel with the expectation that there will be benefits, not just from Israel, but maybe with closer relations with the West and the U.S.?
Is Israel a democracy?
Well, I think it's fair to say that if you think about Israel just within the 1967 borders, it is. It's a qualified democracy. It's not a liberal democracy in all of its formulations. So, yes, it is a qualified democracy within the 1967 borders. It is not a democracy if you begin to think about this one-state reality where half the population is disenfranchised with really no rights whatsoever. So, no.
For those who may not be aware, 1967, that is the Six-Day War, the June War of that year, where Israel occupied territory after a preemptive war on its part, right? So Egypt and Jordan were about to attack it, so it attacked those two countries. You can correct me if I get any of this wrong, Michael Barnett. And after the Six-Day War, it occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and some other areas, and has held on to all of those until, well, in Gaza's case recently, but still occupies the West Bank.
Yeah, and, just to sort of close out the texture, yeah, it was a preemptive strike in June 1967 by Israel. The antecedent events were that Egypt and the Arab states began to mobilize in violation of various sort of international agreements, began to mobilize under the claim that they were going to end Israel and throw, this was part of the language at the time, throw the Jews into the sea. Israel, rather than waiting for the Arab states to strike and then sort of defend itself, engaged in a preemptive strike, which, most international lawyers see as justified. And in that preemptive strike, they occupy the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, which, of course, then later became part of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. They occupied Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Israel subsequently very quickly annexed first Jerusalem and then later annexed the Golan Heights. The disputed territories remain Gaza and the West Bank.
I think I said Egypt and Jordan. I should have said Egypt and Syria.
Syria, yeah.
Yeah.
The Israelis begged the Jordanians to stay out of the fight, but because of domestic pressures and needing to demonstrate that he was part of the Arab alliance, King Hussein did get involved, and the consequences are there.
And then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel to try to regain territory they had lost in the 67 war. So all these Arab-Israeli wars is what led to the Camp David Accords of 78, the peace between Israel and Egypt, and both leaders paid for that with their life, if I'm not mistaken. Well, Sadat was assassinated, but
Sadat was assassinated, not Begin.
I got him confused with the Yitzhak Rabin, who was killed by an Israeli extremist after the Oslo deal. So there you go.
Right, in 95, yes.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, what's a good place? Sorry about that, Michael, but where is a good place to start? I guess we could go to 48 and the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians were displaced in the creation of Israel. We can go to 67, 73, 93. I think there's a common thread through all of this is that Palestinians believe with reason that they have come out on the losing end of all of these.
And, I think a better place to start would be in the early 1900s, when you first began to see not a groundswell, but you began to see Jewish immigration into Palestine, which at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. World War I comes, you have the Balfour Declaration by the UK, by Britain, which pledges to help assist the development of a homeland, not state, but a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. They have, not a surprise, the untenable and impossible task of trying to negotiate between these two contending nationalist movements. There were these ongoing commissions that kept trying to find some kind of negotiated arrangement, never quite worked. By 1947, after the end of World War II, the British announced that they've had enough and they're leaving. They said, by the way, here you go, UN, it's back in your lap. And the UN decided through resolution to create two separate states, two separate homelands, one for Palestinians and one for Israelis. This has been a conflict that's been going on for, 130 years, 120 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think people will say, it's been going on for, centuries, thousands of years. They're wrong.
Yeah.
The roots of the current conflict are in the politics of the last 100 to 125 years.
The easy way out for many people is to say these are ancient hatreds. And we say this about whether it's Bosnia or Rwanda or anywhere else in the world. And that becomes, a lazy person's idea of just saying we don't need to know much about history.
How have Israel's domestic politics changed in recent years with respect to this problem and the two-state solution?
If you think about it in terms of where Israel was in the 90s, there was a kind of ambiguity during the Oslo process whether Israel was accepting that it was going down the road of a two-state solution. In 93, it's not clear that Rabin and Peres saw it that way, but certainly by the end of the 90s, there was a recognition that that was supposed to be the end point. It was one that was largely accepted and championed by many in the international community. You began to have an openness to the idea of a negotiated settlement, which was huge, very important development. But then, as we talked about earlier, there were a variety of events that essentially soured Israelis on the idea of any kind of negotiations that would lead to peace with the Palestinians. And this became the process of a rightward turn in Israeli politics. And it's not just being driven by Palestinian-Israeli confrontation. There are other things going on. But there's a rightward shift in Israel, and it has been taking place over the last 15, 20 years. It's accelerated over the last 10 years. And now we have a point where some of the leading members of the Israeli government were followers of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who had established the Koch party that the Israeli Knesset at the time decided to outlaw because it was a racist terrorist organization. But now, what used to be seen as anathema has now become increasingly normalized in Israeli politics. And so we see that development taking place in the territories. And it's also linked to, the other big struggle that's going on in Israel is not about the Palestinians, of course, but it's about the future of Israeli democracy and an independent judiciary. Many people have said these two are not separate. They're very much entangled and connected. It does demonstrate that there has been a rightward shift in Israel. And again, Israel's not alone. We're seeing this kind of move in terms of populism and illiberalism across countries that used to be, squarely within a democratic camp.
Hungary comes to mind, although Hungary's only been a democracy for a short time. But well, I'm not sure where to close here. Predicting the future is impossible, but I don't see a good outcome in this situation.
And I think people have been closing with that statement for a long time. I don't see a good outcome either. As much as you might hope that if we name Israel as an apartheid state, then somehow we're going to see, an international mobilization to try and sanction Israel like we saw with South Africa. I don't think that's going to happen. South Africa happened in the 1990s where there was democratic waves. We're at a different moment now.
Sanctions aren't very effective in general, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, they're not.
I'm not saying I support or against that position. I'm just...
Yeah. It takes although, sanctions of various kinds could potentially deliver some very strong signals. No doubt.
Or U.S. pressure. Before we started recording, I mentioned to you how my previous episode was about Beirut in the early 1980s. Ronald Reagan very strongly criticized Israel publicly. Of course, you pointed out to me the U.S. gave Israel the green light to invade Lebanon in 1982. But afterward, Reagan was aghast at the killing of civilians in Beirut, etc., and very publicly chastised Israel to get out of there and worked very hard at getting Israel out of there to establish some type of peace in Lebanon and a potential two-state solution. That was what Bob Ames was working on before he was killed by Hezbollah, one of the first suicide bombings on record. But anyway, not to digress, there is really no U.S. pressure right now to get a solution here.
No, but I do think that there's an interesting change going on behind the scenes. We already saw, in many ways, a dwindling of American support for Israel. Not great, but some cracks. We've seen some cracks in the Democratic Party. My colleague, Shibli Tohami, runs a variety of public opinion polls, and one of his show that Americans now have more sympathy for the Palestinians than the Israelis. First time that's happened. Now, will this translate into a political change? Will Congress somehow take action? I doubt it. But one of the interesting things from the article is we've gotten a lot of private support from former high-ranking White House officials, not just Democrat, but also Republican. And in the current administration, we've also, gotten wind that there's a lot of sympathy for our arguments. Now, what will that mean in terms of action? I actually doubt very little. We're coming up to another presidential campaign, which is not the time you want to pick on Israel. You also have Congress is very supportive of Israel. Jewish Americans are increasingly split, but the evangelical community provides a very strong support network for Israel. So I don't see any change happening immediately. But then again, if you would have told me that we be having this conversation now, and that we would see as many people agreeing with this kind of position as we did from last year, I would have thought you were crazy. When we started this project that led to the book and the article 3 years ago, we didn't know where we were going to come out at the end. We thought we were going to be the lone voices out there. Much to our surprise, we find that actually we were a little bit behind the times. So things are rapidly changing. What this means, in terms of potential pressure on Israel or on the Palestinians, I couldn't tell you. But I can tell you that certainly for the foreseeable future, this is a disaster. It is an absolute disaster. And unless there is some kind of great disruption that moves the needle back towards a negotiated settlement, we're just going to see more violence and oppression.
And generations of Palestinians living without any prospects for a decent life.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Michael Barnett of George Washington University. And again, I will place links to his essay in Foreign Affairs with his 3 co-authors, as well as the response that was written in that same publication at the story page for this podcast episode at washingtontimes.com. And also, you should sign up for my newsletter. You can do that at historyasithappens.com. You'll get an email from the Washington Times every Friday morning. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Damon Linker will return to the podcast. We will revisit the question, is it the end of Trumpism? Now that Donald Trump has been indicted for allegedly stealing top-secret government documents. Will his populist wave do as past populist waves have done? Or will this kind of politics persist? Is the Republican Party now permanently the party of Trump? Insofar anything can be permanent. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.